In mid-September 1950, General MacArthur's risky but successful surprise attack at Incheon, coupled with the breakout of the Pusan perimeter, forced the North Koreans to retreat north towards the border with China along the Yalu River. In early November, the Chinese launched a massive attack, sending the Korean War into a new phase of uncertainty. How did the Chinese pull off such a massive surprise attack? What actions did MacArthur take in response? And what were the tensions between General MacArthur and President Truman? And how did those tensions affect the war? For answers to these questions and more Army History Insights, stay tuned.
Welcome to the U.S. Army History and Heritage Podcast, the official podcast of the United States Army Center of Military History. The Center of Military History writes and publishes the Army's official history, manages the U.S. Army Museum Enterprise, and provides historical support throughout the U.S. Army.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. I'm Lee Reynolds, the Strategic Communications Officer for the Center of Military History. In this episode, we're discussing the Army's role in the Korean War from the Chinese invasion in the fall of 1950 through the early summer of 1951. Joining me for this discussion is Army historian Dr. Peter Knight. Well, welcome back, Pete.
Thanks, Lee. It's great to be back.
Yeah, glad to have you again. And just a little reminder to folks about who you are. So Dr. Peter Knight is the Director of Historical Studies Division, or Directorate, at the U.S. Army Center of Military History. Dr. Knight joined the Center of Military History after retiring from the U.S. Army as a lieutenant colonel after 23 years of service in the military intelligence branch. In his military career, Dr. Knight served in numerous tactical and strategic level intelligence positions. He had a combat tour in Iraq in 2008 and served in 2 academic postings as an instructor and later assistant professor of history at the United States Military Academy at West Point from 2004 to 2007, and as an Army ROTC professor of military science at Princeton University from 2011 to 2014. Dr. Knight is a 1994 graduate of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, and he earned his Ph.D. in history from The Ohio State University in June of 2006. His area of historical specialization is strategic intelligence in the Korean War. He also wrote his doctoral thesis on this subject and published a chapter on intelligence in the Ashgate Research Companion to the Korean War, which came out in 2014. All right, so Pete, you've been with us now. This is the 3rd episode for the Korean War. So we've talked about, initial invasion and the North Koreans, trapping the Koreans, the Americans, the UN forces, and the Pusan perimeter. They break out and they push the North Koreans. North Koreans People Army, I think it's called.
The NKPA, yeah,
NKPA.
North Korean People's Army.
All the way back up, almost winning the war, and they're now up right near the border with China at the Yalu River. So can you just set up where we are and maybe both sides, just give that strategic setting?
Sure. So we have to remember that the choice to continue on above the 38th parallel is indeed a political choice every bit as much as it is a military choice. There was discussion in Washington circles about whether or not to proceed beyond the 38th parallel. Certainly, General Syngman Rhee, who is the president of South Korea, is all about going above the 38th parallel and trying to achieve the full reunification of Korea. But there was some talk in the Truman administration about whether or not to continue. But the Joint Chiefs of Staff made the point that it was important to pursue the North Korean People's Army and ensure its destruction, to ensure that there would not be renewed communist aggression in the future. And so the JCS arguments versus the more diplomatic arguments for not going across the parallel, Truman weighed both of those and ultimately sided with the Joint Chiefs of Staff and General MacArthur.
So their intent then was to basically destroy the army, but then but not to join the Koreas?
No, but also to join the Koreas.
Okay.
It became a follow-on objective to the destruction of the North Korean People's Army, that in the process they had the opportunity to try to reunify Korea as one whole country, which is something they thought it was in their best interest to do at the time. So moving that choice to move north certainly was agreed to across both political and military chains of command. On the 15th of October, 1950, President Truman flies to Wake Island in the Pacific and meets with General MacArthur to discuss the strategic options. At that point, they discuss the possibilities of Soviet or Chinese intervention in the war. And MacArthur at that point tells Truman that he is no longer fearful of Chinese intervention, let alone Soviet intervention at that juncture. Yeah. They felt that the optimal time for any such intervention had already passed by at that point. MacArthur was also very confident that if the Chinese were to intervene, that United Nations air power and artillery firepower would be enough to repulse any such effort by the Chinese. So with those reassurances, MacArthur and his forces proceeded northward, only to encounter the Chinese in late October 1950. And there were diplomatic warnings that preceded this. On 1 October, Chinese Foreign Minister Zhou Enlai made an explicit warning that if anyone other than Korean troops approached the Yalu River, that China would indeed intervene. If anyone other than those units crossed the parallel and approached the border with China. And so that diplomatic warning was largely ignored. They felt that in many ways the Chinese were bluffing, that they weren't well trained enough or well supplied enough to be able to sustain any long-term offensive against the UN forces. What they failed to take into account is all of the Chinese military experience in their own civil war, let alone against fighting the Japanese during World War II. And there were a lot of battle-hardened veterans, to include officers, not just enlisted men, to be able to prosecute that war effort.
Wow. So where did the disconnect come from? Was this just bad intelligence again?
So in late October 1950, the UN occupies the North Korean capital, Pyongyang, and the 8th Army is poised to cross the next river between them and the Yalu, the Changchon River, in full force. And on the east coast, across the Taebaek Mountains, on the other side of those mountains, on the east coast, the 10th Corps under General Alman had relocated from Incheon, and they were preparing to land at Wonsan and Iwon, two coastal ports, to begin their drive to the Yalu River. And morale was high. The UN soldiers thought that they were literally entering the final phase of the war. But as early as the 1st of October, I mentioned that warning from Zhou Enlai and the Wake Island meeting with MacArthur. And so, how do we end up bumping up against a Chinese force? Where did they come from? How did we not detect them? The Chinese Communist forces move mostly at night. And this is obviously to avoid detection from our reconnaissance aircraft during the day. But we also had nighttime photo reconnaissance units that were part of the Far East Air Forces. But the photographic technology at the time was absolutely primitive compared to what we know today. And, you remember those old flash bulbs that used to be on those Kodak cameras. Well, imagine that on a larger scale where you had flash bombs that were dropped from an aircraft fuselage to illuminate the sky and allow the camera to take a photograph at nighttime. That technology was limited, and it did not hold up well under the harsh winter conditions that were present in North Korea. The lenses would fog up, the camera apparatus would freeze, certainly snow and fog would obscure any photos, so they don't detect them that way. The Chinese were experts in employing camouflage techniques, and they were draconian when it came to noise and light discipline, to the point of shooting stragglers or troops that would deviate from that discipline. They wore white winter layers to blend in with the snow jacket. They skirted the high ridge lines and tried to stay off the roads. The vehicular traffic, they were very clever. They could hide them under haystacks during the day and herringbone them off the road to make it look like a normal little farmhouse with a bunch of haystacks outside of it. So they avoid detection that way. They also move under radio silence to avoid comment detection, although there is some circumstantial evidence that some false radio traffic may have contributed to the read that UN intelligence had on the Chinese. And then CCF troops that were taken prisoner would give false unit designations and troop strengths to their interrogators to further throw them off in terms of order of battle analysis. So a very concerted effort by the Chinese.
Well-planned deception operation. I mean, this goes straight back to Sun Tzu. If you read Sun Tzu, this is just exactly what he used to talk about.
Yeah, and that's one of the things, I found in my study of this in graduate school was that it wasn't all ineptness on the part of the United Nations, G2, Willoughby and his staff. The enemy gets a vote, and the enemy went to great lengths to try to throw us off. And so,
well, we had recently been allies, so they knew, what our tactics were, and so they developed a good means to counter that.
Indeed,
counterintelligence, I guess.
Yeah. So for most of those reasons. When you think about when the Chinese first hit us in early November, they disappear almost as rapidly as they appeared. And then there was a lull for a while after the initial attacks near Unsan in late October, early November. And so everyone's kind of thinking, well, what does this mean? Is this a major intervention on China's part, or is it not? Because they'd seen some formations, but not a massive offensive.
Which goes back to what MacArthur said. They don't have the means to do a large-scale attack, and maybe they were thinking that this is a small attack, and they shot their shot.
Right, that they're trying to deter. And so they decide then that MacArthur and his subordinate commanders decide that they can make a final push and that they will. And again, the folks in Washington, in the Truman administration, the JCS, they do not want to deny MacArthur that opportunity. And his credibility after Inchon, of course, was very high, and so they're not as prone to questioning him or his judgment. When in fact maybe they should have. But another thing that in the case of MacArthur, everyone says, he succumbs to strategic hubris in this instance, and that may be true to an extent. But there's also the fact that when you look at the different types of intelligence, photographic intelligence, or IMINT as we know it today, communications intelligence, or SIGINT as we know it today, and HUMINT, you have 2 out of your 3 major intelligence sources telling you the Chinese are not there in strength, where you have 1 that's telling you it is. And that's based on your prisoner interrogations and your contact, direct contact on the line. So when you look at it from that perspective, perhaps their resistance to the idea of a massive intervention or their gradual begrudging approach to acknowledging it is a bit more understandable knowing that.
Wow. Right. So now let's talk about the invasion. You mentioned briefly how they came in, they backed off. So where did they come in? What was it like? How far did they push the UN forces back?
Okay. So first contact happens on 25 October. And it's in the ROK's 2nd Corps sector. The 3rd Battalion, 2nd Regiment of the ROK's 5th Division moved northwest.
And the ROKs are the Republic of Korea.
The Republic of Korea.
South Korea.
Yes, yes. So that unit moved northwest from Ongjong, 50 miles from the Yalu River. And 8 miles west of that village, the 3rd Battalion encountered what they thought was a small force of North Koreans. But it was, in fact, a Chinese Communist force element. And that CCF element destroyed the 3rd Battalion. Later on the evening of the 26th of October, the ROK's 6th Division ordered its 7th Regiment to withdraw, but before it could do so, they received another CCF attack, and the 7th Regiment headed further south on 28 October, and it ran into an enemy roadblock that had been set up 20 miles south of its initial position. So here we begin to see the Chinese tactics. They'll hit, and normally they'll go after the rock units first because they're less equipped and they're less well prepared. And so they'll hit the rocks, and then they will move around their flank, and they will try to cut them off with roadblocks along their route of egress in an attempt to surround and destroy the unit. More attacks followed in late October against a couple of the other ROK divisions, and this causes the ROK 2nd Corps, which is on the right-hand side of the 8th Army, to have to pivot in that direction to address the threat. This opens up a seam between the ROK Corps and some of the U.S. Corps, the 1st Corps in particular of the 8th Army. And so then General Walker has to move units in to try to plug the gap. And then when during the afternoon of the 1st of November, the CCF attack in the vicinity of Unsan, and they attack the right flank of the 1st Battalion of the 8th Cavalry Regiment. And then the 1st and 2nd Battalions are in the lead, and the 3rd Battalion is in reserve. But pretty soon, they attack the 1st Battalion, 8th Cavalry all along their line, and they also hit the 2nd Cavalry. And then the 8th Cavalry gets the order to withdraw south, and the 3rd Battalion comes up just south of Unsan. But as the 8th Cavalry withdraws, all 3 battalions become trapped again by roadblocks from the Chinese forces south of Unsan. And eventually they will overrun the 3rd Battalion CP. Fighting will become hand-to-hand, and the 8th Cavalry's 3rd Battalion will cease to exist as an organized force. And so, you know, you had 2 Chinese divisions, the 116th and the 115th, that will overrun the 8th Cav at Unsan. So that's where they bloody the nose of the 8th Army. But then they disappear just as fast as they had reappeared. By the 6th of November, the front is quiet again. Wow. And so everyone's left to kind of reassess, what does this mean? Yeah. And so the posture of UN forces at the time, by this time, the United Nations has 425,000 ground troops, 178,000 of which are American, and about 225,000 are Republic of Korea, and then the rest of the United Nations elements contributing to that total. The CCF had 300,000 People's Liberation Army troops in Korea, plus the remnants of about 5 weak North Korean divisions and 2 depleted brigades. So as that initial attack comes and goes, Walker and Almond begin to conduct reconnaissance and force missions to begin to probe back up towards the Yalu. And by this time, 10th Corps forces have landed on the East Coast, and they push all the way up as far as Haisenjin on the Yalu itself. And so they're beginning to make plans to follow on with major offensives, 8th Army on the 24th and 10th Corps on the 27th of November, respectively. So on the 25th of November, 8th Army attacks again, and they are struck again by the CCF. And the CCF hit the 9th and 38th Infantry Regiments of the 2nd Infantry Division, 18 miles northeast of Kunuri along the Changchon River. And the Chinese now, their attacks are made manifest, and they sound off with their bugles before these massive human wave attacks. And they hit units of the 8th Army on both sides of the Changchon River, ironically near a formation called Chinaman's Hat. And the infiltrators attacked elements of the 23rd Infantry just behind the 9th Infantry Regiment of the 2nd Division. Even though the Chinese take heavy casualties and have to suspend their attacks in the early morning hours, they resume them again just before dawn. There's some vigorous U.S. counterattacks, but there's a lot of back and forth here. And eventually the Chinese concentrate enough forces to begin to overrun the positions. And the U.S. soldiers have to dig in and consolidate and await these new Chinese attack thrusts. And the 8th Army's situation is complicated by the fact that the CCF breaks through elements of the ROK Second Corps on that right wing of the Army, and it exposes the rest of the right flank of the 8th Army. And now Walker is compelled to have to withdraw his units, because now you'll have entire Chinese field armies that are corps-size elements that are attacking into the flank of the 8th Army. Oh, wow. And Walker's only chance to save his units is to get far enough south of that flanking attack so that he can reconstitute and refit and begin to plan for counterattack. So Walker responds quickly. He sends the 1st Cav Division and the Turkish Brigade to protect possible Army lines of retreat. He halts the 24th Infantry Division in the west and prepares to conduct an active defense as he prepares to retrograde. At this time, Walker's G2, Lieutenant Colonel James Tarkenton, raised the estimate of Chinese troops in the area from 54,000 to 101,000. But even then, Walker and his G2 still do not realize the size and the scope of the Chinese offensive. No one did. Yeah. Far East Command headquarters merely reported to Washington that this was a slowing down of the UN offensive may result from these new attacks. That's what the assessment read at the time. Late on 26 November, Chinese forces struck again on the 8th Army's right flank, exploiting the collapse of the ROK Second Corps, and the Chinese threw 5 entire field armies against the right flank of the 8th Army. So Walker is doing what he needs to do now just to try to retrograde, and more Chinese forces are pouring into the gap between the ROK Second Corps and the rest of the 8th Army. So he has to get below the Changchun River and even further below to escape the Chinese thrust from the east. So the idea was to conduct a deliberate fighting withdrawal to a more defensible line. But the other thing that's causing a problem for the 8th Army are the refugees who are clogging the roads. And these massive groups of refugees actually provide cover to the CCF and the North Korean infiltrators, some of whom would put on civilian attire and blend in and filter through UN checkpoints and open fire in the UN rear areas. So CCF forces renewed their thrust. They outflanked and blocked the egress of the 2nd Infantry Division, trying to annihilate it. And the 2nd Infantry Division had all they could do to run the gauntlet and try to escape southward. These battles along the Changchun River were a major defeat for the 8th Army, and a mortal blow to the aim of reunifying all of Korea by force of arms. The 2nd Infantry Division alone took 4,500 battle casualties from 15 to 30 November, lost almost a third of its strength, along with 64 artillery pieces, hundreds of trucks, and nearly all of its engineer equipment. Although 24th, 25th Infantry Divisions and ROK 1st Infantry Division were still relatively intact, the U.S. 2nd Infantry Division, the Turkish Brigade, ROK 6th, 7th, and 8th Infantry Divisions were shattered and in need of refit. And although they weren't closely pursued by the Chinese, General Walker decided to keep going further south so he wouldn't be enveloped by any fresh Chinese attacks.
Now, are we south of Pyongyang yet?
Not yet.
Okay. So we're still relatively north in North Korea.
Correct.
Okay.
Meanwhile, over in the 10th Corps sector, along the east coast and center of the peninsula, and remember, the Taebaek Mountains separate the 10th Corps from the 8th Army.
So the east from the west.
That was another vulnerability, because remember, this is not one contiguous line between the 8th Army and the 10th Corps. They're separated by the mountains, which is dangerous, because then they're subject to defeat in detail. So again, the CCF forces stymie the UN advance in the east. Major General Almond had intended to use his ROK 1st Corps to push up the east coast toward the Yalu to protect the right flank of his 10th Corps. The 10th Corps was to attack north and west of the Changjin Reservoir. Its 7th Infantry Division was to occupy the center of the 10th Corps front, push to the Yalu at Haisenjin, about 160 miles north of Wonsan. On the left of the Corps sector, the 1st Marine Division, under the command of General O.P. Smith, was to proceed up both sides of the Changjin Reservoir, about halfway to the border, and then tie in with the 2nd ROK Corps of the 8th Army out to the west, near the Taebaek mountain range. But that's a tall order, as I said before, to try to join those units together. They were supposed to push then 60 miles north to the Yalu. But General Smith, the Marine commander, was very leery about dispersing his division over too broad of a front. And he ordered his units to attack cautiously and stay within supporting distance of one another. Because the terrain in this part of Korea, it's all narrow roads cut by gullies and valleys and imposing ridge lines and the mountains surrounding them. It makes it critical for units to stay together in order to reinforce. Right. And then rounding out 10th Corps was the newly arrived 3rd Infantry Division that landed in Wonsan in early November and was augmented by a ROK Marine Regiment. These units were to guard the 10th Corps rear and be prepared to support any follow-on offensive operations as needed. And then, in a seemingly minor change of plans, Major General Allman ordered the 31st Regimental Combat Team of the 7th Infantry Division to relieve the 5th Marine Regiment on the east side of the Changjin Reservoir, also known as the Chosin Reservoir. So the Marines could concentrate their forces on the west side of the reservoir and stay more concentrated, as General Smith wanted to do. The 31st Regimental Combat Team, like the rest of the 7th Infantry Division, was still widely scattered and making its way into the area in bits and pieces as it comes from the port of Iwan. The roads were treacherous and the trucks were in short supply, and various battalions and artillery assets only slowly began to assemble on the east side of the reservoir under Colonel Alan McLean. So the 31st Regimental Combat Team commander, Colonel McLean, had the 1st Battalion, 32nd Infantry, and 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 31st Infantry. 1st Battalion, 32nd Infantry Commander, Lieutenant Colonel Donald Faith, was the first to reach the new positions, relieving the Marines on the 25th of November. So what you have here at the Chosin Reservoir is you have the 1st Marine Division to the west, you have the Marine headquarters on the very south end of the reservoir, and then you have Task Force McLean and Lieutenant Colonel Faith on the east side of the reservoir. Their plan was to attack on the 27th of November. That attack was never to come to fruition. Late on 27 November, the Chinese strike the U.S. forces on both sides of the Chosin Reservoir nearly simultaneously. 2 CCF divisions, the 79th and the 89th, attacked the Marines west of the reservoir in the Udam-ni area. The Marines killed Chinese by the hundreds, but were in danger of being cut off from their division headquarters at Hagaruri on the south end of the reservoir. In a similar manner, the 80th Chinese Division struck the spread-out positions of Task Force McLean on the east side of the reservoir, attempting to flank it and then cut it off from the Marine headquarters at the south end of the reservoir. The Chinese were finally stopped just before dawn. On 28 November, General Allman and his aide, Lieutenant Alexander Haig, helicoptered into the perimeter of Task Force McLean, and despite all evidence of a massive Chinese intervention, Allman exhorted his soldiers to begin the offensive, saying, "We're still attacking," and he told his soldiers, "We're going all the way to the Yalu." That evening, the CCF struck again, and the CCF 80th Division hit the dispersed U.S. units with waves of infantry. And despite the reassuring presence of anti-aircraft weapons that the units had, the sub-zero cold and the constant Chinese attacks began to take their toll, and fighting was often hand-to-hand. On 29 November, Colonel McLean was convinced his position was no longer feasible, that he couldn't attack, and he ordered a pullback to consolidate his units into a tighter defense, and then he'd wait for his last battalion that was still yet to arrive before attempting any type of attack. During the withdrawal, his troops came under renewed assault, and he was captured by the Chinese. Then Lieutenant Colonel Faith assumed command of the task force, and the task force becomes known as Task Force Faith. 2 attempts were made to send an armored tank column to the relief of Task Force Faith, but the icy roads, misdirected UN airstrikes, and continued Chinese pressure thwarted those efforts. By 1 December, Task Force Faith is in a precarious position with no help in sight. Chinese assaults had nearly destroyed their defensive perimeter, and nearly 600 men had been wounded, nearly 25% of the entire task force. Lieutenant Colonel Faith decided to withdraw and run the gauntlet down the frozen road along the east side of the reservoir in the forlorn hope of reaching the Marine headquarters at Agaru-Ri on the south end of the reservoir. Of the 2,500 men of Task Force Faith, 1,000 were killed, wounded, or captured, or left to die of wounds, to include Lieutenant Colonel Faith. After the air evacuation, about 500 7th Infantry Division soldiers were left to accompany the 1st Marine Division as it began its torturous withdrawal from Agaru-Ri down a defile road 50 miles southeast to the port of Hungnam to try to evacuate by sea. The men of Task Force Faith did not die in vain. They bought time for the Marine regiments to be able to withdraw from the west side of the reservoir. Had Task Force Faith not done what it did, the Marines and everyone could very well have been trapped, and the Chinese could have enveloped them at the reservoir and prevented their egress further south. So faced with these massive Chinese attacks in the 8th Army sector and the 10th Corps sector, General MacArthur is now forced to concede that he faces an entirely new war. And he summons Walker and Allman to Japan to talk about strategy, and MacArthur is clearly panicked at this point. He is talking about everything from trying to have the 3rd Infantry Division attack due east from Wonsan into the CCF flank. He's trying to figure out if that could be done, but the units consider it too risky and the terrain makes it impossible. MacArthur was asking for Chinese nationalist troop support from Taiwan. He's denied that. Because Truman doesn't want to send any signals about escalation of the war. And this gets into a lot of the conflicts that are going to make MacArthur and Truman butt heads in a big way, because MacArthur is being told, he wants to strike the CCF bases in Manchuria. He wants to strike at their airfields. He wants to strike at their logistical bases. And he is denied the ability to do that because they're on the wrong side of the international border. And the Truman administration wants to confine the conflict geographically to Korea. And so, they're trying to compromise with MacArthur and say, well, you can bomb the bridges over the Yalu River, but only the Korean side of the bridges. This rankles MacArthur to the core, because he's like, how do you bomb half a bridge, right? I mean, this isn't precision-guided munitions in these days, right? And then, oh, by the way, how do you protect the aircraft that are trying to do that when MiG-15s can fly in a dive pattern from across the border in Manchuria, attack the planes, and return to Manchurian airspace where they can't be touched.
Can't pursue.
So these things naturally wear on MacArthur as the commander, and so again, that'll set the stage for conflicts later on. But then, of course, as General Walker continues his withdrawal. Then comes the Jeep accident.
So what happens here? So by this point, we're about right before Christmas, right? December 23rd, I believe.
You are correct. December 23rd, General Walker is planning to attend an awards ceremony where he was actually going to pin a medal on his own son, among other soldiers. But he was traveling up a main supply route, if you will, MSR, and there was a ROK Army convoy coming the other way, and there was a truck that pulled out to try to pass this slower-moving set of vehicles. At the same time, Walker's Jeep was proceeding northwards, and the vehicles collide, and Walker is thrown from the Jeep and dies of massive head injuries he sustained upon being thrown from the vehicle.
So now here's the leader of the 8th Army.
Leader of the 8th Army is dead. Now, to MacArthur's credit, he had always planned for any contingency where General Walker was to be killed, and he had already had a successor earmarked, and that was Lieutenant General Matthew Ridgway, who was working in the G357 section at the Pentagon at the time.
Oh, wait, so Ridgway's in D.C.?
He is in D.C.
Wow.
And it's almost Christmas, and he's getting the call, pack your bags and head for Japan.
So MacArthur chooses someone who's not even in the theater of operations.
No, they he had reached agreement with the Chief of Staff of the Army and the Joint Chiefs that if anything were to ever happen to General Walker, Ridgway would be the person.
Yeah.
They wanted Matthew Ridgway, and for good reason. So Ridgway, of course, is a very dynamic personality. Of course, he was a well-known commander from World War II with the 82nd Airborne and the 18th Airborne Corps. Very magnetic personality, very aggressive personality, just the kind of things that you want to see in a commander. So when Ridgway assumes command, he's really taken aback by the lack of offensive mindedness, the lack of any offensive planning on the part of the Eighth Army, and he really sees a defeatist type mentality. The morale of the Eighth Army is taken a nosedive. He will at a certain point he certainly makes known his intent to want to go on the offensive.
But when he takes command, are they still in retreat or are they holding the line at this point?
They are still they've gotten to a line just below Pyongyang, and so now Ridgway's going in there and saying, no, we need to start getting ready to attack again. But nobody's thinking along those lines to the point where he's relieving division commanders and staff officers as a result of this. And so the word's going out quickly, hey, this guy wants to go on the offensive and try to get back on the offensive. And so, in doing so, even though he's relieving a lot of people, he's making the soldiers start to reestablish contact with the enemy because they had broken contact. Instead, if they have to withdraw anymore, he said, you're going to do it while you're in contact with the enemy. You'll patrol, you'll take prisoners, you'll interrogate, and you'll maintain contact with the enemy so we can set the conditions for a new offensive. His success in turning the Eighth Army's morale around using little more than his magnetic personality and bold leadership is still a model for the U.S. Army today, showing how the power of leadership can dramatically change a situation. He basically takes the Eighth Army and shakes it by the throat and gets it straightened out and ready to attack again. But that's not instantaneous, obviously. The Chinese are capable of launching massive attacks, and they're going to keep the pressure on. So Ridgway begins to strengthen the defensive lines, especially above Seoul, while trying to bring the 10th Corps out of the east section of Korea, back by sea through the port of Pusan, back up to join the 8th Army as another corps of the 8th Army.
So are they abandoning the East Coast then? Or?
Well, it's just that Almond's 10th Corps will no longer be an independent command. It will be part of a unified 8th Army push up the peninsula that will go from, it will span West Coast to East Coast, but at a point further south. Before Ridgway's changes and plans can be implemented, the CCF attack again. On the 26th of December, the CCF strike hard at the UN units on the western approaches to Seoul, with supporting attacks in the central and eastern parts of the line. The Chinese hit the ROK units hard. Again, there's a pattern here. They're going to exploit the less well-equipped, the less well-prepared units, and then they're going to try to exploit the seams between the American units and the ROK units. And so they in fact do that. 8th Army had to pull back another 30 miles to a defensive line along the Han River trying to protect Seoul. By the 2nd of January 1951, both the 1st and the 10th Corps had successfully withdrew to that defensive line, and they had extensive firepower at their command to include air support, maximizing their chances of holding Seoul. However, there was a danger that these two corps could be outflanked to the east and forced to defend Seoul with their backs to the water. And that's the ROK units that are on the eastern side are not having as much luck holding the Chinese back. And so Ridgway has to withdraw again to subsequent lines to protect his unit, to get to a point where he can have enough defensible terrain to reset, refit, and resupply and begin to plan a counterattack. And so that's what he does. He's trading space for time, and only by pummeling the advancing Chinese with artillery and airstrikes is he able to halt them for long enough to reconsolidate. On the eve of the renewal of full-scale UN offensive operations, the Eighth Army had 178,000 plus American soldiers and Marines. There were 223,000 ROC Army troops, and then the UN ground contingents from all 16 nations. These forces were organized into 5 corps from west to east, the 1st, 9th, 10th U.S. Corps, and then the ROC 3rd and 1st Corps, respectively. Generally speaking, ROC forces held the more easily defended rugged terrain in the east, while the U.S. forces were positioned on the lower, flatter areas in the west, where their greater mobility and firepower was most effective. Arrayed against the UN forces were some 290,000 Chinese and NKPA troops. Chinese Communist forces were organized into 7 corps, or field armies as they called them, 22 divisions strong, primarily holding the western and central portions of the Communist front. About 52,000 NKPA soldiers organized into 3 corps and 14 understrength divisions held the eastern sector. Meanwhile, some 30,000 North Korean guerrillas were operating in UN rear areas in the mountainous part of eastern South Korea. So Ridgway starts ordering his front lines to conduct aggressive reconnaissance and force missions starting on the 15th of January, 1951. These missions helped establish outpost lines and laid the groundwork for a resumption of the offensive. On 20 January, Ridgway issues a directive to 8th Army to convert their reconnaissance and force missions into a deliberate counterattack, codenamed Operation Thunderbolt. Thunderbolt was designed to discover enemy dispositions and intentions with a show of force and dislodge the enemy forces south of the Han River. So phase 1 of that operation ran from 25 to 31 January. The 1st and the 9th Corps move out 20 miles into the area south of Seoul, and they begin to advance. As January nears its end, however, Chinese resistance gradually increases, and the 3rd U.S. Infantry Division joins the attack in the 1st Corps sector. And then Thunderbolt is converted into a full-scale offensive, and Ridgway tries to expand the offensive all across the UN front. Now he starts to throw 10th Corps and the ROC 3rd Corps into the mix in an operation known as Roundup. So they begin pushing, and then the Chinese counterattack and begin to push them back, and all of these gains that I described earlier start to become negated. And then the Chinese start pushing against the 2nd Infantry Division at a key road junction near the village of Chipyong-ni.
Oh, yeah.
Chipyong-ni becomes a very important point that the Chinese forces tend to gravitate towards. They want that key road juncture because it affords them entry into the Han River Valley against the 1st and 9th Corps in the western sector of Korea. And so it affords them flexibility between both parts of the UN line. And so Ridgway understands this, and he tries to get the Chinese to focus on Chipyong-ni. He hoped the 5,000 American and French troops defending it would become the center of attention. And in fact, they do. The Chinese throw 3 divisions against that perimeter on the night of 13 to 14 February. UN air support forces the Chinese to limit their attacks to the hours of darkness. While the UN troops held on in Chipyong-ni, Ridgway and Ullman sought to stabilize the UN line between Chipyong-ni and Wonju in the very center of the UN line, trying to plug gaps created by earlier defeats of ROC units. And as I said before, the Chinese love to hit the ROC units and exploit the seams between the major units. So Ridgway made a timely use of reinforcements, the 27th British Commonwealth Brigade and the ROC 6th Division, to try to stabilize the line and come to the relief of the units surrounded at Chipyong-ni, and he succeeds at that. By 15 February, the UN line was fully restored, and the Chinese are facing supply problems as well as heavy casualties, and they begin to pull back. UN ground artillery and air firepower was simply too strong. With the enemy beginning to withdraw, Ridgway immediately orders an advance by the 9th and 10th Corps. This offensive becomes known as Operation Killer. Ridgway hoped the name of this offensive would encourage an offensive spirit in the 8th Army. The 9th, 10th, and Rock 3rd Corps were directed north to a line known as Arizona, 12 to 15 miles north of their current front lines. Operation Killer was designed to inflict further damage on the withdrawing enemy forces, and it proceeded very methodically, and by 28 February, all units had reached the Arizona line, finally eliminating all enemy forces south of the Han River estuary.
Wow.
With General MacArthur's full support, Ridgway plans a subsequent operation called Ripper to continue the UN advance 20 to 30 miles north to a new line called Idaho, with its arc and apex just south of the 38th parallel. While restoring the territorial integrity of South Korea remained a broad strategic objective, weakening the enemy's military power was the primary operational goal. So Ripper commences on the 7th of March, 1951, with the 1st and the 9th Corps on the west near Seoul and Hoangsong, and the 10th Corps and Rock 3rd Corps in the east. After one of the largest UN artillery bombardments of the war, the 25th Infantry Division crosses the Han River, establishes a bridgehead, and the 9th Corps crosses. 3 days later, the advance proceeds to its next phase line. During the night of 14 to 15 March, elements of the Rock 1st Division and the U.S. 3rd liberate Seoul, and the capital city changes hands for the fourth and final time in the war. And then the CCF abandoned it as UN forces approach from the east, threatening the defenders with encirclement. As Ripper enters its final stages, UN units gain 30 miles from their initial jump-off point, and Ridgway staff plans a new operation codenamed Courageous, designed to trap large Chinese and North Korean forces in the area between the Han and the Imjin River north of Seoul, opposite the U.S. 1st Corps. This operation features an airborne drop of on 22 March by the 187th Airborne Regimental Combat Team onto the south bank of the Imjin near Musan-ni, 20 miles north of the current UN front line. Armor and infantry elements link up with the paratroopers and force the communist units to withdraw, avoiding encirclement. So as March 1951 draws to a close, 8th Army units were nearing the 38th parallel. However, there were indications now that the Chinese and the NKPA were massing forces for a spring offensive. Ridgway decides to press further north to more defensible positions on better terrain. He launches operations Rugged and Dauntless to get to new lines known as Line Kansas and Line Wyoming. This is a defense-in-depth type preparation where they will make a forward outpost line at Line Wyoming above the 38th parallel, whereas they will be able to use that to gain contact, and then they'll fight a deliberate withdrawal to the Kansas line that will be the main defensive line, in the hopes that they will exhaust the Chinese in the process of moving between those two positions. Now, during Operation Rugged, this is in April now, we get some very turbulent leadership changes in the high command.
Yeah, so let me just ask a couple questions about that. So you were talking about basically Ridgway, who's leading the UN forces. So what is MacArthur's role at this point?
Yeah, so I mean, so Matthew Ridgway is the Army commander on the ground, right? MacArthur is still in charge of all United Nations forces, but he's chafing at the restrictions that are being placed upon the UN forces, especially, once they had when they were approaching the Yalu River. MacArthur, as I said, was only allowed to work within the geographic confines of North Korea, even though they're enduring air attacks from Manchuria and unable to interdict CCF operations that help sustain their offensive. And so MacArthur chafed at these restrictions that aimed at limiting the war geographically. He did not see the dangers of escalating the war that in a way that might bring in the Soviets, who of course are nuclear capable as of 1949, or expanding the war against China, and possibly causing a world war in the process, And so MacArthur mentions the potential use of atomic weapons.
Publicly? Or
well,
is that just
he does a lot of back channel communications. He does talk to the press at certain points, and Truman puts a gag order on MacArthur, which MacArthur tends to violate, and he makes back channel communications, particularly to one Joseph Martin in Congress, expressing his displeasure and his disagreement with the administration on the prosecution of the war and the limitations imposed upon him. When Truman gets wind of these, because Congressman Martin shares some of these back channel messages publicly, when that comes to light, Truman decides, that's it. I'm going to relieve General MacArthur, which he does on April the 11th, 1951. When he does so, he places Ridgway in immediate command of all UN forces. So Ridgway is no longer simply the 8th Army commander. He is the UN commander. Within 4 days of Ridgway's appointment, General James Van Fleet will become the new 8th Army commander.
Okay. Does Ridgway remain on the peninsula, the Korean Peninsula? He goes to Japan?
Once he's had a chance to hand off to Van Fleet, he will go immediately to Tokyo and assume his duties there. He will, of course, need some time just to talk with General MacArthur before he departs, and so he makes that a point to do that. So, the whole relief of MacArthur becomes a case study in itself in American civil-military relations, right? Trying to reinforce civilian supremacy over the military, right? MacArthur, of course, his credibility had soared after Inchon. People didn't want to question him. It was a real awkward situation because you have the senior man in uniform by date of rank as well, senior to anybody in Washington. I mean, to a point where, the JCS are sending plans to MacArthur's headquarters in draft form to gain approval, before they issue it to him as an order. Right, it's really kind of awkward.
Are you okay with us telling you this?
Yeah. And MacArthur is MacArthur.
Yeah.
And so he pulls no punches, but he makes the mistake of making his disagreements public, and to the point where Truman no longer trusts him to carry on the limited war that he is directing.
Yeah.
And so he's done. And this creates a political firestorm here in the United States. Here's this World War II hero and the man who's overseeing a successful occupation of Japan.
Right.
And now all of a sudden he's fired. I mean, what's this? What's our president thinking?
Yeah.
But President Truman does give quite a full explanation as to why he relieves MacArthur. So now we have Ridgway in full command. And the 8th Army is turned over to Lieutenant General James Van Fleet, who would follow through with absorbing the CCF Spring Offensive, which begins on the night of 21 April. And UN forces fight a controlled withdrawal to the Kansas line, as I described earlier. Despite the extensive use of airstrikes and massed artillery, the multiple enemy penetrations of the Rock Army positions and exploitation of unit boundaries destroyed 8th Army's hope of establishing that defensive line along line Kansas. And the fighting during the Chinese Spring Offensive is extremely bitter. In the 3-day period between 24 and 26 April 1951 alone, 6 American soldiers will earn Medals of Honor, each distinguishing themselves with exceptional gallantry in separate defensive actions against large assaulting enemy forces, inflicting disproportionately heavy casualties on the attackers. The 8th Army completes its withdrawal to a new line, which Van Fleet deftly called the no-name line, by 28 April and held the position on good terrain. The Chinese attack at that point sputtered out. They were coming to the end of their supplies. They always had more soldiers, and they're more than willing to throw those lives into the mix. But their supply issues start to really
and let me just ask you
light.
about that. There's I don't know if it's an urban myth, but as you mentioned, they had more people than they had supplies. So the story goes that the Chinese soldiers would just run up. They wouldn't have weapons, but they would pick them up from the fallen soldiers. I don't know if that's true or
there probably were some instances of that. But I would say food and medical supplies become very short, and so that becomes more of an issue for them. The new 8th Army line that Van Fleet has, the no-name line, extended from the Han Estuary in an arc 6 miles north of Seoul and then out northeast across the peninsula to the east coast. And as the Chinese pull back to try to resupply, General Van Fleet takes advantage of the lull, and on 9 May he has UN forces make limited attacks north to prepare for another major offensive. But by the time he does so, within a week, the Chinese have reconstituted and are ready to start another offensive. But this offensive only lasts for 2 days. So again, there's supply issues.
Yeah.
They're not able to rectify those quickly. Van Fleet immediately went back on the offensive, and by 27 May, UN forces were again at or slightly north of the 38th parallel, and by 15 June, UN forces held the Kansas line. And so the UN line was anchored in the west at the Han Estuary, extended northeast, south of what is known as the Iron Triangle, curved around the UN-controlled Hwachon Reservoir right in the middle of the peninsula, and then rose sharply north to meet the Sea of Japan on the east coast, 42 miles north of the 38th parallel. So this front line, with minor modifications, would actually become the ceasefire line that is agreed to in 1953. Wow. So we're at this point in June of 1951.
Yeah.
But the war is going to go on for 2 more years beyond this, with very little change in the actual
Any other major
line.
Well, we'll get into this. We've got a couple other podcasts that's going to focus on the rest of the war, but for the most part, like you're saying, it stays right here, right around the 38th parallel. And at this point, they're finally talking about, well, let's get to the table. Let's talk.
Indeed.
Yeah. So so the first of the peace talks actually begins.
That's correct. And so, the first peace talks, they'll sit down near the village of Kaesong. And this is in June 1951. Secretary of State Dean Acheson signals that we're willing to go to the negotiating table as long as we can restore. We've restored South Korea's territorial integrity. Now let's talk settling this thing, because he's basically announcing that United Nations are abandoning any goal of trying to unify Korea completely.
Okay. Yeah.
And so, even though neither side of the Korean leadership wants to settle.
Yeah.
They want to continue to try to unify the country. Syngman Rhee is against any sort of armistice. So is Kim Il-sung. But at this point, the superpowers that they are allied with, respectively, are leaning on them very heavily to say, you know what, we've had enough of this, and we're not going to do this in perpetuity. So we need to talk armistice. And so they lean on both sides. But the big sticking point in the negotiations becomes POW repatriation.
Oh, interesting. Wow.
So many communist prisoners did not want to return to North Korea or China. Yeah. And this was an embarrassment to the communist regime, as you might imagine, both for North Korea and communist China and the Soviets. The UN command held about 150,000 communist prisoners, and the communists held about 10,000 UN prisoners. But the sticking point, again, was not wanting to go back. And President Truman had to really give some serious thought to this, because if he had agreed to just the full exchange per the Geneva Accords, then he could have proceeded right into the terms of the armistice and the armistice line. But he makes the moral, conscious decision that, hey, it's not right to send these people back when they don't want to go.
Yeah.
And so he made that a condition. Wow. And the war continues on. And so, of course, it won't be till 1953 when they finally do sign an armstice on July 27th. 1953.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Pete. That's been a great overview. A lot of details here, but a very important time frame in the war here. So thank you for all of your insights today. But before we close, we have our little HUA trivia segment. So is there some piece of trivia you can share with us about this time frame?
Yeah, definitely. During the fighting around the Chosin Reservoir, temperatures often dipped to 20 degrees below zero. UN troops would often wake up and the bolts of their weapons would be frozen solid in place. They had to resort to urinating on the weapons to thaw out the bolt assemblies to be able to actuate, maintain them, and employ the weapons.
Oh, wow. There you go. All right. Yeah. When it comes to, you got to use that weapon. Yeah. Any means, I guess. Well, cool. Well, interesting. Thanks so much, Pete, for all your information today about the Army in this phase of the Korean War. So if anyone wants to learn more about the Army in the Korean War or learn more about Army history in general, then I encourage you to explore our website at history.army.mil. And if you want to learn or experience Army history every day, then visit our social media sites on Facebook, X, and Instagram. So thanks for joining us today on the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. For the Center of Military History, I'm Lee Reynolds, and until next time, we're history.
The views expressed in this podcast reflect those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or opinions of the U.S. Army or Department of Defense. For more information about the Army's proud history and heritage, go to history.army.mil.